Okay, so let's start. Hello and welcome to the webinar on evidence-based practice organized by the British Blockchain Association. My name is Dr. Naseem Naqvi. I'm the president of the BBA and also chair of the Center for Evidence-Based Blockchain. We have with us Professor Rob Briner, who is the scientific director of Center for Evidence-Based Management, and he's a professor of organization psychology at Queen Mary University of London. Rob has authored and co-authored many books on evidence-based practice. He is a visiting speaker at many universities. And over the past 20 years, he has consulted and coached many organizations and CEOs on finding ways to improve the use of evidence and various types to enhance organizational and also individual decision-making. This webinar is not about any specific technology-related evidence-based practice, such as blockchain or AI. We are going to be organizing some sessions on that in future, but this is going to be rather generic principles of evidence-based practice that are relevant, especially to C-suite executives, senior decision makers, and managers. And so we're going to start. So participants are going to be muted. However, please feel free to post questions in the chat box, and our team will try to put these to Rob after his talk. We have about 20 minutes for Rob's talk, followed by about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&As. So without further ado, let's welcome Prof. Briner. Rob, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time today. So give us an overview of what is evidence-based practice, what is it, and why we should care.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Naseem. Well, Naseem asked me to address 5 questions, which I'm going to do now. And this is the first one: why evidence-based decision-making or evidence-based practice? And I think the easiest way to answer that is to ask yourself this question: do you want to do stuff at work that addresses important problems or opportunities? And do you want to stuff that's more likely to work? Now, if your answer is yes, I do, then you need to make better informed decisions, which means evidence-based practice or something very like it. And evidence-based practice has been adopted in numerous professional fields to do exactly those 2 things. So these are roughly the dates at which these different fields, from medicine to social care to management more recently, started talking about evidence-based practice in the way I'll be talking about it today. So it's been around for a while, and it's kind of, people have tried to adopt it in a number of fields. And these different fields often have centres, and you can see in the top left centre evidence-based medicine, below it evidence-based policing, policy making, conservation, education, agriculture, aged care, social work, and so forth. So it's been around for a while, and people regard it as one way of thinking about how you make better informed decisions. And 10 years ago, we established a Centre for Evidence-Based Management to do for the profession of management and leadership, I guess, what those other centres tried to do for those fields. Naseem then said, what's the evidence that evidence-based practice works? And I'd like to use an analogy here. So imagine, and this is going to be very hard for everyone to imagine at the moment, given lockdown and so on, but imagine you arrive in a large European city you don't know on, say, a Tuesday evening, and you really, really, really enjoy food and eating in restaurants. Somebody's buying you dinner and they want you to choose a restaurant. So you might think about what kinds of evidence. It could be TripAdvisor, it could be a concierge, could be a guidebook. You might ask yourself, are they reliable? And would you actually use them? Well, probably you would, unless you already knew the city, which in this example you don't. So you look across a number of sources to try and basically choose where this person's going to buy you dinner. Now, the questions you need to ask in relation to evidence-based practice is, are you more or less likely to get a good meal if you use some versus no evidence? Are you more or less likely to get a good meal if you take a structured or systematic approach versus an unstructured one? Clearly, if you use a structured approach. Are you more or less likely to get a good meal if you use multiple sources of evidence versus just one? For example, asking a concierge. Are you more or less likely to get a good meal if you do so use the information with an awareness of how trustworthy or reliable it is versus not being aware of that? Now, clearly, if you understand that example, that it's always better to use some evidence, it's always better to adopt a structured approach, it's always better to draw multiple sources, and it's always better to use information in a critical way. So if you accept that analogy, you basically accept the principles of evidence-based practice. Now, There's little direct evidence in management and some of the fields that it would be, but you have to ask yourself, why would a well-informed decision not be better and more effective than making a poorly informed decision? So that was the second question. The third question is, what is evidence-based practice? What are the key steps? So this is a definition. It's not my definition in particular, but it's the conscientious, explicit and judicious use of multiple sources of evidence to increase the likelihood of a favourable outcome by following a stepped or structured approach. And it's important to note it's not about certainties or probabilities, it's about likelihood. If we do X, it's more likely to get to the outcome we want than doing Y or doing nothing. So it's about probabilities and likelihoods. Now, why do evidence-based practice in any field? Well, I guess it's because you, as I mentioned right at the start, you want to focus on what's important and what's most likely to work. So in a management context, evidence means any relevant information. So typically it's scientific findings, organizational data, your own expertise as a professional, and stakeholder concerns and perceptions. And this is the key thing. All practitioners always use evidence. That's a given. Everybody always uses evidence. However, we tend to pay limited attention to the quality and relevance of evidence. We use limited sources, and we're easily pushed off track when trying to make better informed decisions. So we always use evidence, but that is not the same as an evidence-based approach. Now, this infographic, which I'll make a bit bigger in a second, is produced by the CIPD in the UK and the Centre for Evidence-Based Management. And you'd use something like this, but always to first identify a problem or opportunity. And if, and only if, one is identified, you then try and use that to identify a possible solution or an intervention. So it's a sort of two-step process to begin with, but also going through this process. So there's the four sources I mentioned. Different sources of evidence, there's the definition I mentioned, and here's the steps. You ask a question, you acquire the evidence, you critically appraise it, and this is back to the idea of what is its quality, you aggregate it, you put it together, you apply it, then you assess and look at the outcome you've got. So again, it's about increasing the likelihood of a favourable outcome. Now, I'm just going to very quickly, I won't get into all of it, but just for completeness, it's on the slides. These are the kinds of questions you might ask if you're approaching a potential problem or opportunity. Now, I'm going to use an example that's more from human resource management of employee engagement. So employee engagement is something like commitment or motivation or satisfaction. It's a kind of attitude. It's the idea that someone's engaged with the organisation in some way. So many organisations think their engagement levels are low and they should try and increase the scores that typically they collect using a survey or questionnaire. They're going to try and increase the scores because it's too low somehow. So what kinds of questions would you ask about both this problem and a potential solution from an evidence-based practice approach? And these are just examples. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly. And evidence-based employee engagement, for those of you not aware of it, these are some typical books you might find, popular books, The Extra Mile, Engaged, Chief Engagement Officer, even a For Dummies book. So you can see it's a very popular idea at the moment, at least in management. I think it's going slightly out of fashion now, but nonetheless, it's a kind of important idea. Well, it's seen to be an important idea. So again, here's the four sources. So firstly, in no particular order, you might look at your own expertise and your team. So identifying the problem, have we seen this EE, this employee engagement? Have we seen this engagement problem before? What happened? Based on experience, is this level of engagement a problem? And if you think it is, you might then go on to ask similar questions of you and your team, your expertise. Have you seen interventions before? What happened? Do they work? What do you believe about it? And always ask how relevant, applicable and trustworthy is our expertise. It may be extremely trustworthy and relevant, it may not be, but that's the critical appraisal part. The second area is organisational data. What actually is the problem? What is the level? Are our measures valid and reliable? Do data show how and if low engagement is causing problems? So can you find relationships between, say, engagement going down and, for example, absence going up? And if there is some sort of problem, then again, the same process. What does your organisation tell you about potential solutions and how relevant, applicable and trustworthy are our data? You do the same with the scientific literature. You go and look at what the best available scientific evidence had to say, and you do the same for stakeholders. And again, asking how relevant, applicable and trustworthy it is. So that's the basic process. You ask a set of questions to gather evidence to make a better informed decision, both about what might the problem or opportunity be, and if you're fairly clear there is one, then also to do the same process for identifying potential solution or intervention at all. So the next question Nassim asked was, what can senior managers do to become and leaders become more evidence-based? I think the first thing is to commit to doing what's important and what's more likely to work. Now, this might sound a bit odd, the idea that very senior people don't do that. And of course they do sometimes, perhaps most of the time, but sometimes they may not. So I think it's a commitment saying we're going to focus here in our energies and attention, effort on what is most important for us and what's more likely to work. I think understanding what evidence-based practice means is very important because there's lots of myths around it, and I'll talk about those in a second. I think it's important to change the structure and process of decision making, which means giving yourself time, for example. It means making it a bit more transparent. It means getting multiple sources of evidence. I think another important change is to incentivize and reward following an evidence-based practice process, not just rewarding people for doing stuff, not just rewarding and incentivize people for hitting targets and getting stuff done. That's not so important. What's important is have people follow this process in making decisions about what to do. Also, making resources available is incredibly important, things like training, skills, access to information, data and evidence. I think for senior leaders, it means to be prepared to be challenged, to get things wrong, and to become perhaps painfully aware of your ignorance as a leader about lots of things you maybe feel you're supposed to know. And also be very clear about the differences between evidence-based practice and what we already do. And I'll talk about this in a second. One of the kind of challenges is that lots of people think they're doing evidence-based practice already because they think evidence-based practice means we use evidence. And I hope I made it clear it isn't the same thing. So what are the differences perhaps between what senior leaders already do and evidence-based practice? Well, broadly, I think there's three, and leaders need to be aware of this. The first difference is the approach to the use of evidence. And that approach is conscientious, it's explicit, and it's judicious. So it's a kind of package of thinking about how do people approach using evidence and data and information. The second difference is multiple sources, and this is for two reasons. First is to triangulate and cross-check. So we've got some information from stakeholders that doesn't match with the scientific evidence, or maybe it does. But it's also to contextualize and make sense and better use of evidence from other sources. There may be very good evidence from some industry that some intervention is highly effective, but evidence from your context, from your expertise may tell you it's not going to make sense here. So multiple sources is very important for that reasons. And the third main difference between what we usually do in evidence-based practice is following a structured or stepped approach. That means getting evidence for possible problems, opportunities first, and only then considering solution, because we're easily distracted and pushed off course. And I'll talk about these in a minute, but there's many individual and organizational obstacles or barriers. So following some kind of structure can help us perhaps overcome some of those barriers. The next question, or the last question I was asked is, why is evidence-based practice apparently rare in leadership? We're not sure it is, but it certainly appears to be. What are the barriers? There's lots of barriers. I'm just going to talk about the three that are in bold in there. But I already mentioned another barrier further down on the first column is career incentives. That's one issue. Same column, politics and power gets in the way. Things like context, often people's practice is not really evaluated, so it doesn't matter what you do really. In effect, if you're not really awarded for doing things that are ultimately effective, then you'll just tend to do stuff. And I think many of us experience that problem. And the need for speed, people are obsessed about having to make decisions very quickly. So these are just some of the many barriers that get in the way. I'm just going to talk about a few of them. The first one is misconceptions. One misconception people have of this is they feel they can't use their experience and expertise, and that acts as a barrier. But of course, you have to use your experience and expertise. It's part of the evidence picture. It's essential. People also think feels evidence tells you the truth and can prove things. And again, this is another barrier because evidence doesn't, data doesn't, science doesn't. Truth and proofs are only found in things like mathematics. They're not found in data, they're not found in science. That's just likelihoods and probability. So if we're looking for truth and proof, that's too high a barrier and it puts people off trying to make a better informed decisions. Another barrier is that people think it's about making perfectly informed decisions. Well, it's not, it's making better informed decisions. People also sometimes misconceive this as thinking it's about giving you the answer, and it's not. There isn't an answer. It's giving you a more likely thing that's going to more likely to work. And also people think we're already doing it, and that's a barrier. It's possible, but in my experience, it's very unlikely you are. So that's the first barrier. The second one is cognitive biases. You'll be familiar with some of these and the idea of system 1 and system 2 thinking. So system 1 is this very fast, emotional, low effort use of heuristic cognitive shortcuts. That's cool, wow, just things you process very fast without much conscious awareness. And that's great for most things. System 2 is slow, more critical reasoning. It requires more effort. And the idea is we're hardwired to make these fast system 1 decisions because that's great for most everyday decisions. However, system 1 is not good for larger or more complicated, more important decisions. And the idea is, thinking about these biases, we keep falling back to this system 1 way of doing stuff. So these are just some visual examples. This is obviously a visual illusion. These lines are parallel, though they look wonky. These elephants are all the same size, but you know, the one at the front looks the biggest. And again, the blue lines look like they're wonky, but they're actually parallel. And one of the things about evidence-based practice is you look at some data like this and you go, okay, it looks like that, can I check it? And indeed, if you looked at another source of evidence, such as a ruler, or you look down the side of the screen or did something else, you see that in fact these lines are parallel, they're not wonky. And that gives you an idea of the importance of using multiple sources of data. And in this triangle, most people, when they look at it, if I asked you to read it, you probably think it says Paris in the spring, but of course it doesn't. It says Paris in the spring. And again, this is your system one. So the system one, which is very useful for reading and reading quickly, it's not useful for spotting those kinds of errors. So it's not that system one is bad, system one is brilliant for some things, but it's terrible for others. And that's an example. And I won't talk about that example now, but there's many other kinds of bias, confirmation bias, hindsight bias, and there's many, many kinds of cognitive biases. I also think there's a metacognitive bias, which is the belief that we're immune from such biases. And one thing that surprises me quite often going back to leadership is when I've spoken to very senior decision makers and managers, you might hope that they have firstly had training in decision making, and in my experience, very few have, and you think they might be very aware of the idea of cognitive biases, and in my limited experience, very few of them are. So it's an interesting thing. It appears to be that making decisions is seen as just something you do, you don't need to learn, and you also don't need to find out about the ways in which we process information, how that can bias the way we look at the world. So yeah, cognitive bias is another barrier. The third is management fads and fashions. So what are they? There's a new and apparently exciting ideas, practices and techniques. And as they are relatively new, by definition, evidence for their effectiveness or otherwise is very, very limited. As they are exciting, they're very prone to cognitive bias. People tend to love them. So the new exciting stuff that you feel everybody wants. They're often adopted very quickly, widely across countries and organizations. They can strongly shape what organizations do and don't do. And typically, they tend to disappear after a few years and be replaced by the next new and exciting idea. And these are just examples, historical examples of and more recent ones of various kinds of management fads, re-engineering, excellence. Some of you will recognize some of these, some of you won't. Lean, for example, employee engagement, again, which I think is probably a kind of fad. And actually these slides, by coincidence, were already in my slide decks. But blockchain, to me, is just another people just kind of example. Martin Walker has been involved in looking at some of this. And this is a quote, it says, in terms of the demonstrable benefits of blockchain, there's little evidence. The big problem with the blockchain world with confusing could for is, and he says all that it takes to make a credible idea into a fad is people just switch off their brains and stop thinking. And over 20 years in around the banking industry, blockchain is a fad, but I've seen many fads. I'm not particularly picking on blockchain because I don't know much about it, but it's to me, from what I know, it appears to be a kind of classic fad. And again, Forbes magazine venture fad. Then in the Financial Times, this is May 2018. This is May 29. It's slower, more expensive, and disillusionment, etc., etc. So these are just examples, and there's many, many more of different kinds of what probably are management fads. And this is an attempt someone's made to try and say, look at these fads and how they've changed over time. So you look at things like just in time or 1 minute management or managing by objectives. And the point here just is you can observe the way these come in and out of fashion. Why do people go with them? Well, they're fun, they're cool, they're neat, they appeal to system one thinking, which is fine for some kinds of things like buying a new pair of trousers, thinking what you want for dinner. System one's great, but it's not great for more complicated thing. It's quite defensive. You can't get into trouble if you do what everyone else is doing and winners seem to be doing. People often believe the latest thing is the best thing, which in itself is a kind of cognitive bias, I think. If other people are doing it, then surely it works. And most important with the fad, you just don't need to think very much. Cognitive ease. Here's a solution to a problem you haven't even defined yet. And I sometimes think that some of you may have a kitchen cupboard at home with some of this kind of equipment in. And I sort of think management fads are like these things that many of us, including me, buy. We maybe use once, we use twice, and then they just, remain in the cupboard for decades, and we eventually throw them away or give them to a charity shop or something. And the reason we buy these is it all about its fads, it's new, it's exciting, we think it's going to help us, but often we haven't really thought it through. So obviously fads get in the way of clear and critical thinking. They encourage something called solutioneering, which I think is quite an important concept, where you identify a problem by the absence of the solution. We need to do emotional intelligence training. We must do this. We need to adopt practice X. Well, great, but what's the problem? You know, we don't know. The problem is what you've got is a solution you want to implement without knowing what it is. So fads, of course, may be effective, but often not the panaceas they claim to be. Even if they work, their effect may not be loads, and maybe better than what we're doing already. They can, of course, be quite harmful, and they're over-applied to all organisations and all problems. So for all those fads I mentioned, it may be that some of them work quite well in some contexts, for some things, a bit, perhaps even more than the stuff you're doing already. But that's not how fads are typically viewed and marketed and adopted. They're adopted as these wonderful things. So just to conclude, tips for getting started in evidence-based practice, I think try to do it. As already discussed, you can just try these things, use that infographic, just try and sit and see what happens. The second tip, always start with and spend more time getting evidence about an understanding of the problem or opportunity. And if there's one thing I think people could do, is do that. Stop trying to do solutioneering, stop adopting practices, stop doing solution. What is the issue you're actually trying to deal with? And that's really where you should invest the most time and effort initially. Beware of the tendency to look too quickly for solutions and solutioneering. Ask the question, why or what? Why a lot? Be very skeptical of so-called cool, cutting-edge fads and fashions, because the chances are they are fooling you. They're a delusion. The chances are they are. Remember, we're full of biases. Don't just believe what you initially see or hear, but check it out using the evidence from multiple sources. And ultimately, remember, it's about making a better informed decision, not a perfect decision. So the whole purpose of evidence-based practice is to get better at making decisions, making them more informed, and hopefully in the end, doing what's more important for business and organisations and doing what's more likely to work. Thank you very much.